Star Wars. George Lucas. Force. Man-children. Money. Wanga? Now, the last time that I talked about Star Wars on this channel was the last time that I uploaded on this channel. It's been a while since I've put anything out just because
I got depression.
Yeah, I've spent the past few months just feeling super unmotivated, but also I was writing, scrapping, and rewriting a script about Bo Burnham's special Inside. Like most people, I was very moved by it, very inspired. It's probably the best thing that I saw in 2021. All that is to say, I do still have the script, and I still might make a video about it, but there have been so many great video essays out there about the special that have made me just as emotional as the special did, so I don't want to just do it for no real reason and it end up just being me pissing and crying for 20 minutes about how Bo Burnham is the best thing ever. Unless you want to see that. But for right now, the holidays are right around the corner. There's no way that I'll get this out before Christmas. With 2022 having just started, since it's sometime in 2022, I'm assuming it's at least cold outside. With everything going on at a certain point in time, I'm sure a lot of you are like me, and you've turned to your comfort movies. Sort of like at the beginning of the pandemic. You know, I feel like there's this idyllic version of how people were at the start of this thing. I learned how to make bread. Oh, I took up knitting. I turned my dog's shit into compost. Well, I laid on the couch and watched movies, okay, and got depressed about the world potentially ending. And that hasn't gone away. So, thank you. Namely, I watched Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Star Wars. Now, I grew up with all of these movies. I think they're all S-tier comfort movies. Of course, they all have their own blemishes that maybe tarnish the legacy a bit, but no movie has quite a divisive fan base, a diversity in quality, or discrepancy in philosophy, quite like Star Wars. I did not mean to make those all start with D's in the script. This is a 3D experience. Now, I'm going to be discussing the last of these, the discrepancy in philosophy, and I'm not going to be talking about every single piece of Star Wars media. There's probably an infinite amount of books, TV shows, and video games associated with the IP that I would never expect them all to be consistent in terms of messaging. I'm not even going to talk about all the movies. I really just want to discuss the three main trilogies, otherwise known as Disney's Lucasfilm's Skywalker Saga by Disney Plus, A Star Wars Story, Origins. But Cameron, why do you gotta always bring politics into everything these days? Well, first of all, I feel like there's this person that I always default to in these videos, this hypothetical viewer that is super pissed every time that I make a video, and I feel like I just have to over-explain and over-clarify to this hypothetical viewer so that my videos are impossible to critique, which is, of course, impossible. It's me. It's my own insecurities. I'm the hypothetical viewer. Anyway, Star Wars. Why you gotta bring politics into everything these days? You know, Star Wars, of all things, that's the least controversial and divisive franchise there's ever been. You know, everyone agrees on those movies. They love them all equally. All wars matter. Keep your critical Star Wars theory out of my ears, eyes, and schools. And while I appreciate your sentiment, dear viewer, I appreciate your desire to leave that political Star Wars stone unturned. But, as I've said before, everything is political these days. No sense in lamenting that. It just is what it is. Also, one of the things that I enjoy most about films in general is the ability to have a conversation about them. You know, why do I like certain things and not others? What does this movie make me feel? What does it all mean? That's why I made this channel in the first place. My point is not to say that one political ideology is better than all the others yet, but rather discuss the different political ideologies expressed in the three trilogies. So hopefully that was enough of a preface for this video. You know, we're going to keep it fun, keep it light. Saber. Let's strap in and title crawl our way to a galaxy far, far away. See, I got to use my stainless steel tumbler here instead of a regular wine glass because, it would show up weird on the green screen. Why do you have to drink on camera? What are you, a cop? Who's the video guy here? Let's remember who's in charge, okay? Now, it's important to understand the historical context and the political climate of the time in which the original trilogy, the Holy Trilogy, was released. The films are emblematic of the politics of the time, and they also set the tone for what the subsequent films would try to achieve. There's a very relevant historical context in these movies. They were released on the heels of the Vietnam War, which was very contentious and divisive at the time and still is. The rebels in Star Wars represent the rebels or Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. The conflict in the movies also represents the Vietnam War. You have this giant political and military superpower hell-bent on stopping the rise of communism in North Vietnam. As we do, because the only thing that the U.S. hates more than communism is... But eventually, the old U.S. of A. failed and was forced to pull their troops out of Vietnam, allowing the North and South to unite under the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War is even justified. The way that the U.S. got involved in the first place is a little shady, to say the least. There's not really a shocking article title that I can put up behind me right now, but just look up the Gulf of Tonkin and the USS Maddox. You'll see what I mean. Either way, the U.S. after the war was in a state of general bummed outness, and that was just a couple years before the release of a little film called Star Wars. Now, that gives us an idea of what the rebels in Star Wars represent, but the Empire, on the other hand, is an obvious Nazi allegory. You have the Emperor as Space Hitler,
Sussy Baka,
Darth Vader being the embodiment of the SS or the Schutzstaffel. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right. I am a dumb idiot baby boy.
Schutzstaffel.
Vader's suit is a cross between a samurai and a German military uniform. And then, of course, maybe the most obvious similarity is the stormtroopers, who are stand-ins for German shock troopers. There's a ton of imagery and stuff that reflects our own history, but the main idea, the main philosophy behind the three original films is anti-imperialism. Imperialism is when one country enforces their control and influence on another country or planet, because, the Star War. This is not to get confused with colonialism, though, which is more focused on economic control specifically. And colonialism is typically a British thing. I don't know how funny that joke was, but you know what? I'm getting my money's worth out of that wig. So, imperialism, though, was widely regarded at the time of the release of Star Wars as a bad thing to do, parentheses, except when we do it. That's why with Star Wars, George Lucas made the lines pretty obvious. The Viet Cong, as I said, are the obvious good guys in the story, the rebels. Now, the other side, as the Empire, never has there been a more universally accepted example, at least by most people, of pure evil than Nazi Germany. So, George Lucas took a very contentious conflict, the Vietnam War, which had just happened at the time, and put it in a new perspective. He said, hey, if the Nazis did what we did in Vietnam, we'd probably say it was bad. Maybe that means what we did was bad. Not good, for sure. The films are obviously not a one-to-one perfect depiction of the U.S. or the Vietnam War in space. Of course, the United States had not invested hundreds of millions of dollars into a military system that is sphere-themed, designed to destroy entire people groups. Yet. And of course, there's other things going on in the film too. You have the great characters, this journey of self-discovery, this epic emotional battle between true good and absolute evil. But for the sake of this conversation, space Nazis, communists. Now, maybe that's a hot take of sorts to say that Star Wars, literally the most popular movie franchise of all time, paints the U.S. as Nazis. And I'm not trying to argue one way or the other. I mean, you probably know how I feel about it. #based king. But the evidence is clearly there, and George Lucas has said himself that that's what the original movies were meant to represent.
You did something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels.
They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today. We call them Mujahideen, we call them Al-Qaeda.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong. The irony of that one is in both of those, the little guys won.
Right.
And the big, highly technical empire,
the English Empire, right?
The English Empire, the American Empire,
yeah,
lost.
And really, in less controversial terms, all the movies are saying is that imperialism is always bad. I mean, you'd think that that sort of philosophy would be a more agreeable stance to take, especially among conservatives. I mean, look at the Lord of the Rings, okay? That's basically their Bible, besides the other one. And the messaging in that is definitely not, actually, we can keep Sauron's Ring of Power because ultimately we are the good guys, and power, no matter what kind, cannot corrupt us. Do you remember that? Do you remember in the books and movies when Elrond and Gandalf decided to keep the ring? Do you remember that? No, of course not, because that would be stupid. feel like I got a little carried away there. My point is, the idea that certain kinds of power, like imperialism, are inherently corrupt should not be a controversial take. And anyway, this idea of anti-imperialism in the original trilogy, I feel, is only further solidified in the prequel trilogy. The prequel trilogy has always been a bit controversial for being garbage. George Lucas our childhood. And I'm not here to dispute that. Trust me. I've seen the Plinkett reviews probably more times than I've seen the films at this point. I'm aware of all the criticisms, and I agree with them, but I do feel like I have to admit some bias here because at the end of the day, The Phantom Menace was the first movie that I ever saw in theaters. Some of my fondest memories as a kid were playing with Star Wars toys. One in particular I know annoyed the shit out of my family was this dancing Jar Jar toy that played music. I have no idea what happened to it. I think my family may have thrown it out because of how annoying it was. I was going to buy one for this video, but I'd already spent too much on a new mic and everything. So if you have one of these things that you feel like parting with, send it my way. I'd be happy to take it off your hands. So yes, I know the movies are bad, but I'd be lying if I said they weren't near and dear to my heart. And more importantly for this video, like I mentioned earlier, they have consistent themes of anti-imperialism. I know it's not always executed well, but I think it's consistent with GL's original vision. Or maybe his ex-wife's vision, okay? I don't know. The point is, I know the prequels aren't good, okay? The prequel trilogy sucks Watu's nuts. But they do a good job of establishing a theme that I'm trying to build up to here. Episodes 1 through 3 represent the rise of a fascist dictatorship that would become the Empire. It, again, is an allegory for the U.S. The Clone Wars and the overall conflict of the movie are now politicized, though. The good guys are not like they were in the original trilogy. They're not fighting the good fight. They're cogs in the machine fighting a war that is ultimately a catalyst for an unknown evil to achieve absolute power. And the production timeline doesn't necessarily line up here, but George Lucas has said that these films represent his view of the Bush administration. Palpatine represents Dick Cheney, a person who spent his career gaining power and influence through what some would call questionable means. Both Palpatine and Cheney have conflicts that arise, and they use those conflicts to suggest strategies that will ultimately grant them more authority. The most notable instance of this in the films is when the Republic is made aware of a clone army specifically bred to fight a war for them. A war that comes about because the Republic wants to stop the Trade Federation from taking control of more systems, but because they want to take control of those systems. Of course, neither side realizes that they're being fed a false narrative by the likes of Dooku or Palpatine that the other side is corrupt, and so that's why they feel like they need to bring more systems to their cause. And this really isn't something that's fully fleshed out in the movies, more so in the TV shows, because obviously prequel's bad. In this scene, Palpatine says that he would need emergency powers in order to approve the use of a clone army. So him and his blue-horned friend are like, oh man, if only there were someone who could call for a vote that I get emergency powers right now, dude. Aw, hell yeah, man, that would be sick. Jar Jar? Of course, he gets emergency powers. The Clone Wars happen. Palpatine doesn't give up his powers, establishes the Galactic Empire. Star Wars. And one of the other ways that Palpatine rises to power is by manipulating the likes of Anakin Skywalker. Anakin is, according to Lucas, a stand-in for George W. Bush. Now, there's obvious similarities there.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
You're either with us or you're with the enemy. That's clear.
He's a person who has an evil streak in his own right, but who is ultimately a pawn of a much more experienced evil like Palpatine. Or Dick. Now, I've made fun of these movies a lot over the years. I've laughed at George Lucas for being a lazy filmmaker, creating the sets in post, giving the actors nothing to work off of. You know, the scripts were written after the character models and set pieces were even conceptualized. It was undoubtedly
A cash grab.
but if I'm looking at the movies charitably, I would say that the prequels have a clear philosophy that I think is an important and justified critique. I just think it's completely overshadowed by the sheer incompetence of the film, but I still appreciate the attempt to maintain a fairly polarizing vision for a movie that is meant to appeal to an impossibly that was a Jordan Peterson that came out there, impossibly wide audience. That is something that cannot be said for the three most recent films in the Skywalker saga, episodes 7 through 9. Before I talk about the messaging, allegory, and overall quality of the Star Wars sequel trilogy, I want to get a couple disclaimers out there, sort of address the Stefan Malin elephant in the room, if you will. I feel like a lot of hate for these movies comes from a perspective of,
The woke mob ruined Star Wars because they put a woman in a role traditionally inhabited by a white man.
and just bullshit like that, where they think that the movies are ruined because they're just now getting political, because Rey is the main character, and the movies over-deliver on their quota of one black person per trilogy. Ultimately, coming to the conclusion that this, my dear neckbeard, is why women won't date you. Another criticism that the sequel trilogy gets is that it is objectively bad, and if you enjoy these movies, you're just stupid. I think that objectivity in art is an interesting conversation at least, but I think I would conclude that art is in fact subjective, and people spending hours upon hours trying to argue otherwise are really just trying to make people feel dumb. But I'm sure that someone on the other side of this argument would say, wow, what an emotional feelings over facts take from a woke leftist hellbent on tearing down our precious societal structures through postmodernism and gays. To which I would respond, calm down, Jordan. But also, art is one of the few things in life with which it is undisputedly okay to primarily engage through your emotions. In fact, I would say that arguing for objectivity in art and criticizing it in this way, especially with The Last Jedi, is itself an emotional reaction. This clip sums it up better than I ever could.
This is not critique of the media. This is hatred towards real human beings. The offense isn't that the art is objectively bad. It's that people did bad things to me.
Now, I will admit that at the time when these movies were coming out, I did agree with this line of thinking. I thought less of people for enjoying these movies, especially Rise of Skywalker, because, I mean, holy shit. Like, they just brought Palpatine back off screen. What? Snoke was a clone the whole time? Why? How did all these ships get to the planet's surface? Wasn't the whole point of the red around the planet that you couldn't get in unless you had not only the Force, but a dark space crystal just to get in? Why would they have Finn say, I have to tell you something to Rey, only to have him never bring it up for the rest of the movie? This trilogy is done. These actors have contracts. They are done with these movies. Why would he say that? Oh, all your friends are dead? Here's a medal that'll only really make sense to the people watching this movie, you dirty, hairy bastard. Anyway, all this is to say, I think it's really stupid to police the art that people enjoy. I enjoy talking about art and figuring out why I like what I like, but at the end of the day, I'm not looking for a gold standard of media that I think everyone should adhere to. People should be able to enjoy what they enjoy. If it's not hurting anyone, go off, king. Ultimately, the people who engage with art in this way go hand in hand with the people who think that Star Wars and the film industry have succumbed to the woke mob. The point they're attempting to make by establishing objectivity in art is to say that woke libtards have pressured the media and film industry into foregoing their precious social structures because it offends them. The truth is, standards in art have changed time and time again throughout history. Wherever you think those standards were at their peak is ultimately your opinion. Just leave people alone. You may not be aware of the reviews that I am referring to if you're not terminally on the internet like myself, but rest assured, it's just a really uncool way to be. So now that we got those disclaimers out of the way, the Stefan Mullen elephant has left the room. No, my qualms with the new sequel trilogy have nothing to do with their objective goodness or their woke mobness, but rather with their complete lack of consistent philosophy, allegory, or messaging. Now, with the other two trilogies, you can clearly see the allegories that they're trying to make and the parallels that they draw to our own history. You can even look at the historical influences section of Star Wars' Wikipedia page for an overview. The original trilogy, Viet Cong, Nazi Germany. The prequel trilogy, the rise of a fascist dictatorship with Nazi undertones. The sequel trilogy. Hey, apparently J.J. Abrams said one time in an interview that he and the writers discussed one time how it would be cool if the Nazis, who might have escaped to Argentina, started working together again. In space. Now, I'm not saying that the fact that the sequel trilogy doesn't have a foundation in historical influence makes it worse, but I do think that it completely misses the point of what it means to make a cohesive, albeit not always perfect, Star Wars trilogy. With these new films, the line between good and evil is left completely undefined and vague. The First Order are the bad guys because they are. The Resistance is aligned with the New Republic. Or they aren't. They're the underdogs fighting an immense evil. Or they are the establishment fighting a few defected neo-space Nazis. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't misquote me there. Fighting Nazis is the right call every time. But the distinction matters, and it's something that's left completely unaddressed for all three films. Who is Rey? Well, she's nobody, and that's okay. Oh wait, just kidding. She is the granddaughter of the most prominent evil ever to exist in the galaxy. Who is Snoke? Oh, he's this evil that's been unbeknownst to our characters up until this point, who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes without them knowing. Oh wait, just kidding. He's just Palpatine wearing an Oculus Rift. A Force Oculus Rift. We should reject the old sacred text of the Jedi because they clearly have a flawed view of the Force that needs to be reformed so we don't repeat their same mistakes. Just kidding. Just kidding. The obvious reason as to why these elements are left undefined and vague is that the creators had no plan and the movies weren't even helmed by directors in agreement with one another as to what the film should be. I, of course, think there's more to it than that, but we will get to that later. With the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, the films were one person's vision, or at least the organization of one person's vision from the supportive people around him willing to put in the time to formulate his thoughts in a way that makes sense. Most of the time. These sequels may have themes of acceptance and self-discovery, and that's all well and good, but for me, those things are completely overshadowed by the fact that it's incredibly obvious that they had no idea where they were taking these movies. Every film feels like a response to the criticism of the last, to the point where I feel like I'm just watching an insincere YouTuber's apology video. With The Force Awakens, I feel like most people gave it a pass for being a remake of A New Hope. It needed to be something enjoyable and familiar to get people excited about Star Wars again. And I kind of just assumed, okay, a lot of the concepts in this movie aren't really fleshed out. There's a lot of stuff left super vague, but it's the first movie in this trilogy. I'm sure they have a plan. They're going to flesh all this stuff out in the later movies. Then the other two movies came out, and I realized there was no plan. This was all just
A cash grab.
Well, Cameron, that's not really a meaningful criticism. I mean, at the end of the day, aren't all movies just a cash grab? Yeah, of course they are, but at least with the Star Wars films prior to the Disney buyout, it felt like they were trying to say something, but ever since then, it's just felt like we have to make Star Wars content because it's Star Wars. We own this property. How could we not milk it? No pun intended. As I mentioned earlier, I used to be in the camp of people who would criticize these movies for being objectively bad, and the film that gets the brunt of that criticism is The Last Jedi. However, after seeing all 3 movies and being on my based leftist king shit, I think it's my favorite film of the 3. No, don't get me wrong. There's still a lot of dumb shit in this movie that I don't like. The casino scene in particular feels like something straight out of the prequels, where it's well-intentioned in theory, but completely falls flat in execution and is ultimately pointless to the overall story. What I've come to enjoy about this film is that it at least tries to say something, and more than that, it tries to say something new in a Star Wars film. I really like the fact that Rian Johnson attempts to address that the Jedi, especially in the prequel trilogy, were not good. They propagated a very politicized war, and their teachings about the Force were so restrictive that the first kid to ever give it a second thought radicalized, killed them all, and became a space Nazi. I also really like the idea of Rey's parents just being nobody. Every other Star Wars film prior to this always has to be centered around Space Jesus and the Chosen One. This movie finally steers away from that, and I know there are people who didn't appreciate that direction, but I liked it. One of the messages that I've always appreciated about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy is the idea that no one is special. There's no chosen one. No one person can do it alone. You know, even someone as seemingly insignificant as a hobbit can change the course of the entire world for the better. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. Holy shit, did I just compare The Last Jedi to The Lord of the Rings? The movie is not good, but hopefully you understand what I mean when I say it feels like there's a voice there, and that's something that I think has been completely lacking in recent years, definitely since the Disney buyout. Finally, The Rise of Skywalker is one of the worst movies that I've ever seen. It feels like J.J. Abrams is throwing every shitty idea he has at the audience in the hopes that we won't realize what's even going on until the movie's over. That's kind of all I have to say about it. If I haven't already made it clear, the sequel trilogy does nothing to expand on the themes that are addressed and established in the original and prequel trilogies. Don't get me wrong, they don't have to adhere to those same themes of anti-imperialism, but the issue is they replace those themes with nothing. The ideologies of the Resistance and the First Order are left so vague in all 3 films that the only takeaway ends up being good is good, and evil is kind of hot. I mean, it's bad. It's bad. It's bad and evil. Evil is evil. It just sucks because knowing what we know about the original and prequel trilogy, they could have at least tried to keep this one in line with those same themes of anti-imperialism while also maintaining historical references but also having a practical commentary to present day. Maybe after the fall of the Empire, similarly to World War II, the New Republic starts to recruit scientists that formerly worked for the Empire. You know, they want to make a more intimidating version of the Death Star. They want to be the most powerful force in the galaxy. And never mind the fact that the machine has the ability to destroy entire planets. You know, they're the New Republic. They're the good guys. You know, they'll only destroy the bad entire planets. Maybe you have this charismatic yelling man propagating the whole thing, saying we need to get back to the way things were when Palpatine was Chancellor. You know, make the Republic great again, all the while being an Empire sympathizer. I'm not saying that Trump is a Nazi sympathizer here. Just bear with me here, okay? For the Star War. All the while you could have Luke Skywalker being the good guy that he is, realizes that the New Republic that he's worked so hard to reestablish is on track to commit the same atrocities as the Empire. So he leaves and develops a resistance group to fight against them. But his nephew, Kylo Ren, disagrees with him. You know, he likes Chancellor Donald. Chancellor Donald's the kind of chancellor you could get a beer with. And then, you know, maybe that creates some internal family conflict. I don't know. I don't know if any of that would be good, but I know that I would have enjoyed watching them explore that much more than what we got. So, what does it all mean? You know, from the looks of it, someone might think that this video is just an excuse for me to say, hey, the Star Wars movies were better in my day, you filthy Zoomers. And, I mean, yeah, kind of. I just think that the state of the Star Wars films represents the worst of these blockbuster film franchises. It's a movie that's been milked to death, with no discretion or integrity. The filmmakers aren't even allowed to have any kind of message in the movies because the market of this late-stage capitalist hellscape we find ourselves in doesn't incentivize that. I mentioned earlier how it's an impressive feat that the Star Wars prequels were able to maintain a cohesive, pretty divisive philosophy in a movie that was still widely successful at the box office. I don't think that something like that could see the light of day in a franchise like Star Wars now. You know, back then, the sentiment among the producers was probably like, hey, George is doing some weird shit, but he's George Lucas. He made Star Wars, so it's fine. And even then, I'm sure Lucas still felt those pressures. And don't get me wrong, that's probably not all bad. You know, maybe he should have been pressured a little bit more in that case. But it's got to be 10 times as difficult to maintain artistic integrity nowadays as these massive media conglomerates like Disney achieve their monopoly. It's obvious that both J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson felt a huge amount of pressure to make sure that these movies appealed to as many people as possible. You know, make sure that the messaging is super vague and undefined, because if we do an actual critique of a real system in our own world, well, then we might alienate an entire demographic of people. A quote from George Lucas that stuck with me and is really the reason that I decided this video was worth making in the first place comes from an interview with, I don't know, some sex pervert.
Because in the world we live in the system we've created for ourselves in terms of it's a big industry, you cannot lose money. The point is that you're forced to make a particular kind of movie.
In the interview, he says that he is dissatisfied with the American film industry, and he recalls this conversation that he had about the Soviet Union.
And they'd say, oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America? I said, well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want.
And so what do you have to do?
You have to adhere to a very narrow line of commercialism.
So yeah, this video is just an excuse for me to say that the Soviet Union is poggers. Thanks for watching. No, I recognize that George Lucas made a lot of money off of Star Wars over the years. You know, the prequels are a lot of things, but they are most definitely
A cash grab.
It's easy to take everything he says with a grain of salt because at the end of the day, he made those movies. But I think that he has an accurate perspective as it relates to the film industry and general U.S. discourse. I'm just trying to indicate that maybe the system we've created entirely based on profit in every aspect of our society, maybe that's not good. But moving on from the conversation about how capitalism is not only sucking the life out of the people that inhabit it, but it's art as well, this video is about Star Wars. At the end of the day, maybe I'm asking too much of these space fantasy films made to sell toys to children, but it's only because they are so significant to mine and I think a lot of people's formative years. Honestly, I associate them with the first time that I was ever critical of the art that I was consuming. I think a lot of people appreciate when big movies like this have something to say. Don't get me wrong, I don't think the average Star Wars fan wants a pro-communist message in their movies, but I think people like commentary, whether they agree with it or not. Take a movie like Dune, right? You know, talk about anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. That movie was critically acclaimed by people on both sides of the aisle as the best sci-fi film in years. Never mind the fact that half the people on one side of the aisle completely missed the point on it, but I'd like to think that they recognized that the film had something to say, and they liked that about it. There's probably more to it than that, but this feels like it's going to be a long video, and my hard drive only has so much memory. So, in the meantime, I think it's super important that we speak with our wallets. You know, don't support these movies. Don't, you know, buy the merchandise. Yeah. No, BB-8, no!
This is good stuff.